Right.
Yeah.
I started watching it, just crying. Like Steve Martin.
All right, anybody else that wants to grab coffee, brownie, anything on the side here, we're gonna get started. Just a minute. Thank you so much. Yeah.
We're gonna start boarding.
Morning.
Start lining up to Group A. People with disabilities. Please come to the front.
Right, well, I remember. She can look it up. It may be 3 days before.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our iROC here, welcoming. iROC, Investigating Research on Campus, is a chance for us as part of the community to discover the wonderful undergraduate research, scholarship, and creative activities that drive our amount of faculty, the passions and things that they're bringing with them, sharing with their students, and we have a chance to engage in some dialogues, ask some questions, learn a little bit more. Just a few housekeeping rules. Anybody that is attending here, please make sure that your cell phone is off. We will have questions at the end, so please, when we get to the end of the presentation, ask those questions and we'll go ahead and take those from you. Welcome. Very glad to see everybody here today. I am John Damra, Assistant Librarian for Access and Outreach Services, and one of the iROC coordinators. On behalf of myself, our other coordinators, Dr. Evan Markhofer, Associate Professor of Biology, Vivian Milzarski, the Director of Capital Family Library. Welcome. Glad to see you here. I'm going to turn things over to Evan to introduce our presenter today. Welcome.
All right, thank you, John. So I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Zola. So Dr. Zola earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Scranton and earned both his master's and doctorate degrees in philosophy with distinction from the Institute of Philosophy of the Catholic University of Louvain. Is that correct? All right, excellent. Louvain in Belgium. He is taught at the University of Scranton, Penn State Hazelton, and is the former executive director of the Ethics Institute of the Northeastern Pennsylvania at Misericordia University. He is also currently the assistant to the president for mission integration, the director of the Catholic Dominican Institute, CDI, and associate professor of philosophy here at the Mount. He's published a number of articles concerning ethical obligations children have to elderly parents and has made numerous presentations on ethics and elder care ethics to health professionals. His areas of interest are the Catholic intellectual tradition, applied ethics, and elder care ethics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zola.
Thank you very much, Evan, for that introduction, and also to Vivian and John for all their work in setting up this event. Just some kind of preparatory remarks on the topic I've chosen for today. I have to admit that despite the fact that I have taught business ethics for, I would say, more than 15 years, I do very little about the development of business ethics. And if one of the goals of the iROC program is to encourage students to learn, or faculty to learn more about their discipline, this certainly accomplished that because I did learn a lot more about business ethics than I had originally known before I began the project. Also, I'd say that this project began as an invitation I had received from a colleague to contribute a chapter to a book on business ethics. And the topic of that chapter was supposed to be about business ethics in the curriculum. So this is not finished. This is a first rough draft. And so I will greatly appreciate any insights and comments you can give to me after this presentation to kind of polish it up. So it is a work in progress. So again, I thank you for your being here today and allowing me to present this and to hopefully receive some good constructive criticism. So let me begin and with a question, if you care to volunteer. Can you name at least one business ethics scandal that sticks in your mind, either in the immediate present or somewhere in recent history?
Ron?
Enron.
Bernie Madoff.
Bernie Madoff.
Wells Fargo.
Fargo.
Toyota brakes, Ford Pinto.
There we go. Yes, and Martha Stewart. So,
Yeah.
well, there we have it. So I guess it's over. Business ethics. Why bother? Does it do any good? And so I think it's quite obvious that all of us have an example ready to hand in terms of breaches in ethics that almost seem to be commonplace. And so therefore, despite the fact that we do have courses in business ethics, there does seem to be no dearth of lapses in moral judgment in the business world. So a brief or cursory review of daily business news will readily reveal some type of illegal or morally questionable activity occurring somewhere in the business world. Ethical breaches may be as small as a local grocery store intentionally selling products past their sell-by date in the hope of making some profit off of unsuspecting customers, or as large as using insider information to an unfair advantage in purchasing stock. The occurrences of unethical conduct may seem to be so commonplace that one can easily understand the popularity of the disparaging observation that business ethics is an oxymoron. It seems that many professionals and businesses care little for doing the right thing, despite a societal expectation that they should. Given this, one can't help but wonder, business ethics, why bother? In this presentation, I will argue that ethics does indeed matter in the business world. To do so, I will first examine the nature of ethics and how it relates to business. Second, I will consider business ethics as part of a business curriculum. Last, I will propose why this study is essential, even if ethical lapses still occur. Before beginning, let me point out that I use the term business in a very broad way. I intend a common sense meaning which describes the exchange of goods and services between or among moral agents for money or financial gain. This exchange entails many other activities ranging from study and professional expertise, design and research, supply chain and production, marketing and advertising, pricing and selling, that in themselves rely upon a multitude of workers and organizations. The exchange of these goods and services ultimately depends upon customers and others at the local, regional, national, and global levels of human society, with various degrees of government involvement. Ethics in business. To begin, let me situate this topic within a broader philosophical framework. Each discipline and investigation from astronomy to zoology is defined by a goal or purpose. For example, the study of biology is defined as the study of life, and this objective helps define the means for establishing the methodology of research and limits the purview by which the investigation will proceed. The study of ethics is no different. For most people, if asked what it is that the discipline of ethics studies, I think they would reply that it has to do with investigating the nature of what is right or wrong, just or unjust, moral or immoral. There is a family resemblance among the terms used to describe this study. But put simply, ethics is concerned with studying and evaluating human action in terms of its goodness or badness. However, this is only a half-truth. This study presupposes a more fundamental matter. What one should ask is why such ideas are interesting to study in the first place. Why study good and evil, or justice and injustice? Of course, The same question can be posed for any other discipline or field of study. Why bother studying life, literature, mathematics, or languages? For some disciplines, the study is pursued as an end in and of itself. That is, because humans have a natural curiosity about the world in which they live. For some, it's just satisfying to know things. On the other hand, the pursuit of knowledge serves a useful purpose as it permits one to do things with that knowledge or the information that is gained in the study. That is apparent in the tech fields, where study and investigation can build a better computer system or make communication easier. Whereas the physicist is able to unlock the structures of the atom, technology can use that information to create a nuclear weapon. This distinction between knowing for its own sake and knowing for the sake of usefulness is an important one for clarifying the nature of business ethics. If ethics involves the study of the nature of right and wrong, good or evil, is it merely for the ideal of knowing because it is good to know, like the scientist who enjoys the study of atoms, cells, or birds, or because it has some practical outcome, like building a better iPhone? We should ask ourselves what we get out of or profit from the study of ethics. That is, why bother studying ethics in the first place? What can I do with it? I propose that the answer becomes apparent in considering the etymology of the term. Our English word ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, which means character or custom. And the Greek word ethos translates into the Latin as mores, from which we derive the English term morals or morality, another English word often associated with the term ethics. For the Greeks, the study of ethics was concerned with the study or the customary or characteristic actions of everyday human life. That is, how is it that human beings live? Not merely as a living organism among thousands of other living beings, but as a living being that can determine its own end or purpose through the power of reason and by making choices. The human being is a rational animal and does not merely react to its environment and stimuli, but directs itself to known and chosen outcomes either in the present or the remote future. Unlike other animals who merely interact with their environment in customary or behavioral ways, dogs do dog things, trees do tree things, the human animal is able to think about and direct its actions to a number of desired ends. Everything from sailing a ship, waging a war, to boiling water. None of these actions are determined to happen or occur by chance. They are the result of rational deliberation and chosen activity. But such actions are not ultimate. They are directed to a higher or superior end. Aristotle points out that without a final goal or a purpose, human activity would be pointless and lack fulfillment. This goal the Greeks had defined as happiness, or living life well. The activity of human life is not merely about living one's life, but about living a certain kind of life. The human person ultimately desires happiness, or to live well, and all our deliberation and choices orient ourselves in this direction. It is precisely because human reason is defective and that human will can be weak that attention needs to be paid to those customs or actions that human beings engage in, because they result in either achieving the goal of happiness or missing the mark. Therefore, ethics as the study and evaluation of human action is not merely pursued for its own sake, but because it has a practical outcome. In fact, it is this outcome which is the only one that ultimately matters. Today, ethics, academic ethics, is divided into two main branches: theoretical and practical. The former is concerned with understanding the nature of morally good and evil action, as well as the normative actions or obligations that are rooted or spring from these concepts. The latter focuses on the application of these ethical norms to the resolution of ethical dilemmas that arise in a broad range of human activities, from healthcare to law, and obviously, business. The philosopher and ethicist Robert DeGeorge refers to this concept of business ethics as, quote, ethics in business, unquote, and characterizes it as the application of generally accepted norms of our everyday life, such as honesty, respect, fairness, and decency, to the practice of business. However, he goes on to argue that there are two additional ways to understand the relationship between ethics and business ethics as an academic discipline, and business ethics as a movement. Let us consider the first meaning that I have just mentioned. It is obvious that our everyday lives are governed or regulated by generally agreed upon moral principles, such as respect, civility, fairness, and honesty. Such moral norms are constitutive in the relationships among family members, between friends, and society as a whole. These moral norms have had a long evolution of development and are often appealed to in considering the way business is regulated. As such, basic ethical principles are found in everyday life and in business as well. What I liken to George's analysis is his observation that the two greatest forces to have exerted influence in this regard is the Judeo-Christian moral tradition and Western philosophy. For example, the Jewish moral tradition, as articulated in the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, condemns lying, coveting your neighbor's property. In addition, there are moral norms concerning observing a respect for the land and fidelity to promises. Christianity obviously inherited and preserved key moral principles of Judaism, and it expanded upon them. Jesus advocated the sharing of material goods, not only with friends, but enemies as well. He compared the generosity of God the Father to the generosity of a landowner toward laborers in the field, and the necessity of developing one's gifts or talents in order to return a profit to one's employer. The Western philosophical tradition has also contributed to the vocabulary of ethical norms applicable in the practice of business. For example, the concept of justice as a regulation of one's appetite for material goods and pleasures is an important moral principle in Plato's concept of virtue, and one that is further developed by his student Aristotle in Aristotle's treatment of moral virtue as a moderation between excess and deficiency in human action. For both these philosophers, regulation of such desire is an essential means to the end of finding happiness or living life well, and it is essential for the regulation of a well-ordered society. It would be very difficult to live in a happy life if one had to live with those who commit injustice. Later, Christian philosophers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas would further develop the concept of justice as a moral virtue and complement it with the study of the highest virtue of Christianity, charity. What, we may ask, is the difference between treating our neighbors with justice or treating them with charity? Moreover, Aquinas examines the vice of greed and the proper attitude toward material possessions. For example, he reasons that since material goods are intended to sustain human life, whatever a man has in excess of fulfilling that need belongs by natural right to the poor. Post-Reformation theology provides the intellectual grounds for the development of the Protestant work ethic made famous by Max Weber. Enlightenment philosophers contributed to the development of the concept of human rights, the responsibilities and limits of government, as well as the importance of self-determination, or the principle of autonomy. In the mid-18th century, Adam Smith's famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of the Nations, was preceded by a work in moral philosophy that is often forgotten, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In that book, he articulated how the human being was an interplay between two contrasting but complementary forces, egoism and sympathy. These human characteristics provide an explanation of how goods and services are naturally transferred and are the basis of his theory of the invisible hand, which naturally moves the market along in the ebb and flow of supply and demand. Historical developments in the beginning in the 19th and continuing through the 21st century have broadened the scope of where and how moral norms are applied to the practice of business. This is especially evident when we consider Catholic social teaching. The consequences of mass industrialization in the 19th century gave rise to Pope Leo X's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum. Catholic moral teaching began to focus on the exploitation of workers and their moral right to unionize, balanced against the legitimate right to private property and the pursuit of a just profit by owners or capitalists. This attention was sustained and reaffirmed 100 years later in John Paul II's encyclical Gentissimus Annus. As a man who came of age in Poland, where communism was imposed upon it by the USSR in the aftermath of World War II, John Paul II was able to tackle the moral issues at stake in the competing ideologies of capitalism and socialism. Catholic moral teaching on issues related to business continue under the pontificate of Pope Francis. His 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, which has been popularly characterized as an encyclical on the environment, draws particular attention to the interplay of how care for the environment is intimately linked to the issues of poverty and economic injustice. And in the 19th century, philosophers Marx and Engels helped to usher in great political and social changes impacting industry and business with their theories concerning the value of labor and the alienation of workers in the face of massive industrialization. While not exhaustive, I hope that this brief survey shows how the disciplines of ethics and philosophy, and to some extent theology, have contributed to or intersected with the realm of business and shaped cultural understanding concerning issues related to morality in business. The second way that business ethics is understood, according to George, is as an academic field. In his analysis, he points out that post-World War II years had ushered in much social change in America. It was a time that American businesses grew due to the post-war economic boom, the growing chemical industry, globalization, and the exploitation of natural resources. American society became more critical about the growing role of business and started to hold businesses accountable for their newfound economic power. The response of business was to create programs that address these social issues, and the concept of corporate social responsibility was born. Schools of business started to follow this lead, and courses developed around this theme, but they approached the issue primarily from the point of view of managers and the law. Little attention was paid to the application of ethical norms to the social issues, but things were about to change. Traditionally, academic philosophers and business faculty had very little to say to each other. The ethicists did not view business as a worthy area of study, and for their part, business faculty did not think that the disciplines of philosophy or ethics could contribute anything to the discipline of business. However, things started to change with the publication of John Rawls' work, A Theory of Justice, in 1971, which was an important work on political philosophy, bringing together ethical theory, economics, and distributive justice. A conversation soon began between the boardroom and the classroom. Academicians began to see how ethics could contribute to the practice of business, encouraging business to think and act with greater social responsibility. And business recognized that ethicists might have something to say that could help in their articulation of social responsibility. The dialogue between academic ethicists, philosophers, and business people resulted in, quote, an intersection of ethical theory with empirical studies and the analysis of cases and issues, end quote. The first conference on business ethics was held at the University of Kansas in 1974, and by 1980, the Society for Business Ethics was started, and its first meeting was held in conjunction with the American Philosophical Association. Many other groups began to spring up, like the International Association for Business and Society, the European Business Ethics Network, and the International Society for Business, Economics, and Ethics. The first issue of the Journal of Business Ethics appeared in February of 1982, the first issue of Business Ethics Quarterly in January of 1991, and the first issue of Business Ethics, a European Review, in January of 1992. The importance of ethics in the business curriculum was firmly established by the mid-1980s, with more than 500 courses taught across the country to 40,000 students, and more than 20 textbooks and 10 case study textbooks. Further strengthening the academic focus on business ethics, many colleges and universities opened centers and institutes dedicated to the topic of business ethics or incorporating the topic in its programming. The last way that business ethics can be understood as a movement, DeGeorge defines as, quote, the development of structures internal to the corporation that help it and its employees act ethically, as opposed to structures that provide incentives to act unethically, end quote. And he calls this business ethics as a movement. Perhaps one of the most important catalysts that prompted business ethics to examine how they address ethics within the workplace has been a series of federal laws that seek to protect the rights of workers. Among these are the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. These federal laws require businesses to level the playing field in all areas of business, from the application process, job placement, promotion, and even discipline and discharge. Beyond conformity to legal sanctions, businesses have developed clearly stated responsibilities for employees within the organization and have started to employ ombudsmen or chief ethics officers to make sure that the businesses hold themselves morally accountable for their policies. One of the chief ways that businesses have become morally cognizant is through the articulation of their values in mission statements and even incorporating ethics training as part of their business culture. More recent developments have been a renewed sense of corporate social responsibility in terms of environmental sustainability and addressing issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I believe that this overview, a brief overview of the relevance of ethics for the practice of business, has revealed several important points. The first, that the way businesses operate or conduct themselves has evolved, not only in terms of the products or services that they deliver, but also in terms of how business understands itself in relation to the issue of ethics and morality. Second, as business has evolved, society has increasingly held businesses accountable for their actions, both internally and externally. While profit may be the end game of any business, society has an expectation that business will play the game according to set moral principles and with a sense of responsibility for the wider community within which that business operates at both the local and international level. Perhaps it may be argued that both these trajectories are not isolated, but rather two sides of the same coin, each informing the other. Given these dual expectations, it is not unrealistic to expect that business ethics should be considered an essential component of the business curriculum. Business ethics and the curriculum. The matter and topic of teaching ethics or moral education is millennial old. A deep dive into that history is certainly beyond the scope of this talk. However, I would like to circle back and point out that both the Judeo-Christian and Western philosophical traditions that I've just referred to advocate instruction for the young in regard to morality and right living. Quote, train children in the right way when old, they will not stray, from the book of Proverbs. Quote, take to your heart all the words which I am warning you today, which you shall command to your sons to observe carefully, even all the words of the law, from the book of Deuteronomy. And last, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, from the book of Ephesians. That same attitude is found in the moral philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. In his Republic, Plato argues that moral education is crucial for a well-governed state. And in his dialogue, the Meno, he takes up the question if virtue can be taught. Socrates concludes that it cannot. If it could, then virtuous and noble fathers would be able to teach virtue to their sons. But sons do not necessarily become virtuous themselves. However, virtuous individuals do exist, and the question remains, how does this quality rise? Plato's student Aristotle would work out much more detailed analysis of the matter concerning virtue, and was realistic in his observation that young people are bad students of ethics and politics because they are swayed too easily by their emotions and have little experience of the world. Yet he still insisted that children be trained in right habits from their youths, stating that, quote, it is no small matter whether one habit or another is inculcated in us from early childhood. On the contrary, it makes considerable difference, or rather all the difference, end quote. The importance of moral education in terms of the business curriculum is explicitly confirmed. All three of the top accrediting agencies for schools of business require that they demonstrate a commitment to moral education in their curriculum. In 2004, the Ethics in Education Task Force of the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business issued a report which called upon schools of business, quote, to renew and revitalize their commitment to the centrality of ethical responsibility at both the individual and corporate levels in preparing business leaders for the 21st century, end quote. In its 2020 accrediting standards, the AACSB lists ethics and integrity as the first guiding principle and expectation for accredited schools. Quote, The school encourages and supports ethical behavior and integrity by students, faculty, administrators, and staff in all its activities, end quote. In addition, Standard 4, which deals with curriculum content, states that curriculum content be influenced by the, quote, mission, values, and culture of the school, end quote, and that, quote, programs, elements promoting positive societal impact are included in the curriculum, end quote. The Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs, ACBSP, outlines curriculum requirements in its Standard 6. All 4 levels of programs, the associate, baccalaureate, master's, and doctorate, specifically include ethics as an integral part of the business education. The requirement is included within the accreditation standards of the larger section entitled The Business Environment, which also includes topics on law, global dimensions of business, economics, and business communications. And last, the International Accreditation Council for Business Education, IACBE, has a separate line item criterion in its, quote, new program self-study manual, accreditation principles and evaluation criteria, which was published in 2018. The council requires the business curriculum to include ethics, referring to it as, quote, ethical obligations and responsibilities in business, end quote. Similarly, its accreditation standards for accounting majors for all degree levels is broken into 3 main sections: technical knowledge, professional skills, professional integrity, responsibility, and commitment. And this last section includes further specifications. Given the multitude of ethical violations that we witness in the business environment, it is assuring that the 3 main accrediting bodies for schools of business recognize the value of incorporating ethics into the curriculum. Perhaps such training can potentially reduce, if not eliminate, ethical breaches in the future. However, moral education in terms of business is not a new phenomenon. As we've just observed, it has been around for at least 40 years. We may therefore legitimately ask if the textbooks and courses in business ethics have done any good. What is it that a course in business ethics hopes to achieve? What are its learning outcomes? While it is easy for accreditors to require ethics in the curriculum, it is much more difficult to define what it is that it should look like. And even if one can agree upon the point of a course in business ethics, what are the means to achieve that end? As can be imagined, much has been written in response to these fundamental questions over the course of several decades, since ethics and business have become an explicit and focused area of concern. In reviewing the vast amount of literature on the issue, I've concluded that a definite and universal answer has yet to be agreed upon. It is curious to note that even in 1991, after nearly 30 years of discussion to elevate the topic in the boardroom and the classroom, a New York Times piece observed, quote, there is a sharp division within the nation's business schools about how ethics should be taught, end quote. Fast forward to 2022, the situation has not greatly improved. While the accreditors require ethics to be an integral part of the business curriculum, they are not overly prescriptive in how that end is to be achieved. This presents a challenging but exciting opportunity to continue to engage in dialogue and research on the matter. The question of how business ethics should be taught hinges to a large degree upon what the objective of a business ethics course is. The ends will determine the means to that end. One valuable resource on the topic that helps to clarify the matter is Daniel Callahan's 1980 article entitled The Goals in Teaching Ethics. There he distinguishes goals relevant to all ethics courses, regardless of level or context. Goals that are doubtful for all courses and goals that are optimal or important depending upon the context of the course. Given the broad approach he takes, I propose that a good place to start to answer this question and to guide the discussion. I will confine my comments to the first part, his section on the goals of a course in ethics. Callahan lists 5 essential outcomes for any course in ethics. First, stimulating the moral imagination. Students need to be, quote, provoked to the idea that there is a moral viewpoint that is occasioned by our daily interactions with one another. We form relations and act in ways that impact these relations at both the personal and community level. Actions have consequences, and we are held responsible for those actions. Choices can make one happy or miserable or cause suffering. Imagining or raising awareness of morality can be had through a number of means: movies, plays, novels, and it is naturally linked to our human emotions. The feelings of sorrow, pity, anguish, or courage may be delivering a true moral message, but they can never be taken for granted. And a minimal perception to be conveyed to students is the possible difference between what they feel to be right or good and what is right or good. Callahan calls this the pre-moral stage. Stage 2, recognizing ethical issues. The emotional responses just spoken of present an opportunity to move from the realm of feeling to thinking. There must be a, quote, conscious, rational attempt to sort out those elements in emotional responses, end quote. What is the proper response to a feeling of injustice or the violation of autonomy? The rules and moral principles offered in the discipline of ethics provide a framework for organizing and evaluating those emotional responses. In doing so, students should begin to explain or reason about those emotional responses. Number 3, eliciting a sense of moral obligation. An appreciation for the ethical dimensions of a moral question may lead to a sterile outcome. That is, students may be able to determine and appreciate the moral theories that are relevant to a particular situation, but they have no desire to do anything about it. To put it simply, one may recognize the good that is to be pursued and the evil to be avoided, but there is no desire to do so. As a moral agent, we are not merely thinking beings, but beings that, quote, will to act on the basis of our judgment, end quote. As ethics courses should prompt to stimulate students to want to do what has been deemed morally correct. Of course, the caution to be exercised here is not to cross the line from, quote, education to indoctrination, but this can be done by emphasizing the importance of personal moral responsibility for one's actions or inaction. Number 4, developing analytic skills. In addition to recognizing moral principles and ethical theories and how they relate to lived experience, students need to be encouraged to critique and analyze these principles and values. Callahan calls this development of, quote, logical skills, unquote, wherein the analysis of morals requires coherence and consistency and how these principles are applied and in evaluating the outcome of moral choices. In short, students need to be reflective and evaluative about the ethical principles themselves. And last, tolerating and reducing disagreement and ambiguity. A natural outcome of this analysis will be the recognition that several competing theories or answers can be found to one moral question, and these disagreements do not simply stand without more examination. According to Callahan, quote, what often separates ethics from other kinds of intellectual analysis is the necessity of constantly examining the most basic premises of the entire enterprise, end quote. While disagreements exist in all disciplines, they can still operate without necessarily confronting those disagreements. However, in ethics, when confronting the resolution of a dilemma, it is not simply resolving the issue, but calling again into question why the issue is important in the first place. Divergent and contrasting moral viewpoints are an obvious feature of doing ethics, but as a discipline, ethics is continually trying to clarify these issues and moral principles so as to reduce ambiguity and minimize disagreement. Attention must be directed toward finding common ground or shared values. As moral agents, we are ultimately responsible for our own moral choices, but again, we live within a moral community. Our individual moral lives are influenced by the actions of others, and ethics should help us to learn to tolerate moral differences without necessarily abandoning our own moral principles. I believe these foregoing objectives are important as they recognize both the rational and emotional capacities of the moral agent. Doing ethics is not merely applying previously established moral norms or principles to the resolution of some dilemma, as if one can simply select the correct formula and plug it into the equation and calculus or calculate solving a math problem. Callahan's analysis recognizes that an ethics course must sensitize students to the reason why ethics is important in the first place, how ethics operates in our daily lives within a network of relationships, which themselves are invested with emotion and feeling. To be clear, I'm not reducing ethics to a type of emotivism where the morally right thing is what I feel is the right thing. There's a great danger in deciding morality according to emotions. Emotions change and are not consistent. They are not universally shared. and often the right course of action requires we set aside or overcome emotional reaction to a situation. Rather, an ethics course must encourage or motivate students to desire moral goodness and encourage them to avoid moral evil. And I believe that this can only happen once the connection between ethics and human happiness is made. Last section, business ethics, why bother? One of the most important characteristics of virtue ethics in the Judeo-Christian moral tradition is that ethics is not merely about acting in ways that are deemed ethically correct, but doing so with the right intention and as an expression of one's character. As Robert Solomon states in his work, It's Good Business, character counts. He challenges the prevailing view that business ethics is a matter of simply calculating ethical theory and applying it to resolving dilemmas that arise in business. Rather, he proposes that business is, quote, a way of life, an established and proven practice whose prosperity and survival depend upon the participation of its practitioners. Business ethics is not ethics applied to business. Business life thrives on competition, but it survives on the basis of its ethics, end quote. In short, business does what it does because of the moral character of those involved in the practice of it, not in spite of it. I think this is an incredibly important observation, as it emphasizes that ethics is about what we do on an everyday basis. Its starting point is human activity. As observed earlier, we live in a network of relationships that themselves are imbued with and depend upon some basic moral principles, like fairness, honesty, common courtesy, and these keep society running, even if they are not always and everywhere exercised. No one gets it right all the time, and we all have our moral failings. If the study of ethics, business or otherwise, is to be good for anything, it should propose to engage us in the question of finding happiness or living our lives well in the everyday things we do and the things we pursue. To do so is not indoctrination, as Callahan warns, but rather an aid in helping us to identify how we can fulfill the most basic and universal human desire, our desire for happiness. The study for ethics invites us to examine our own values and moral codes in light of more than 2,000 years of collective wisdom and challenge us to defend them when alternative viewpoints are proposed or suggested. If I am correct, then in terms of the activity of business, we should expect that what is ethical behavior outside the workplace should carry over to inside the workplace. As Peter Drucker puts it, quote, there is only one ethics, one set of morals or morality, one code, that of individual behavior in which the same rules apply to everyone alike, end quote. If family unity and friendship depend upon honesty, loyalty, goodwill, we should expect the same in the business community. This view may help us to distinguish between ethical blunders in themselves and the culpability for those missteps. Ethical lapses may arise due to a lack of knowledge or defect of the will. In such cases, we evaluate the culpability of the moral agent in terms of the circumstances. Did they have enough information? Was too much pressure placed upon them? Did they fully understand what was happening and what was at stake? Depending upon that analysis, responsibility for the ethical mistake may be adjusted accordingly. And there is an expectation that the moral agent ideally commits to making a better choice in the future. This stands in sharp contrast to unethical behavior that is intentionally pursued due to greed, anger, or lack of concern for justice. The second type of moral failure is more difficult to deal with, as it reveals something of the moral agent's very character. We may very well ask them, what kind of a person does such a thing? Seen in this light, the moral infractions we witness in business are to be expected and will, given the frailty and limitations of our human nature, continue to happen, just as they occur in countless ways outside the business community. While accrediting bodies can require ethics courses in the curriculum, in themselves, these courses will not guarantee to prevent unethical behavior in the future. However, that does not negate their importance. As a discipline, ethics invites us to engage in a study of fundamental and universal human importance, that which has universal appeal and is ultimately rooted in moral character. I propose that the answer to the question why bother about business ethics is rather simple. Ethics matters because happiness and living a good life matters in the workplace or outside of it. Very much welcome observations, comments, criticisms, etc. Yes, George.
So your title, Why Bother, it reminds me of students, business students who take ethics courses and assume that the world is really about their world, the business world is about profit, and that's the ultimate goal, right? And so in an ethics course, I found that you have to work through that assumption to get to a place where you can recognize that there are other kinds of values in business. Right? There's the intelligence required, strategy required to make a deal, and all those kinds of creativity, innovation, all those things become really important and fulfilling for the person beyond just profit. But it also reminds me that despite those cases that we cited earlier, any given day, there's much more good that's happening in business. As an anarchist, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's true, right? It's just like, students who, yesterday I was having a conversation with students about the news and all these terrible things that happen. That's what we see, but on any given day, I'm going to still assume that more good happens than bad, even though that's not what we see. So I would suggest maybe your title should be Why We Should Still Bother, as opposed to, because the other one seems to kind of assume that those few instances of the bad apples, if you will, are what we really ought to focus on, as opposed to everything that you had to say, which I think are all great reasons for why we should still be concerned with ethics. So that was just by way of comment. I have a question, but go ahead. You want to respond?
Oh, no, just very briefly, and I think that that's a point that Solomon makes, that you don't have to be ethical to be profitable, and you might get away with it because the law will never catch up with you. But the thing that allows what he calls a business scum, the reason why business scum can still get by is because of what you had just pointed out. The vast majority of businesses do survive because they are playing by the rules of the game. And there is an assumption by most consumers or customers that, when they go into the garage, the person's going to be level with them. They're expecting the salesperson to be honest, despite, again, all those cases of dishonesty. So there is this presupposition. So yes, I think that observation is spot on, that there's much more good than negative to be found.
So I'm just wondering, you use the term moral agents throughout, right from the very beginning. So does business ethics and everyday ethics you're talking about apply to business, does that presume a moral agent? In other words, who is the moral agent? And if some of us are not moral agents, then are we excused from being moral?
Yeah, thank you for that. And perhaps I should have defined the term moral agent. So as agent, I derived that from the Latin agere, which means to do or to make. So agent is any thinking and choosing being that is acting and is responsible for those actions. So every single one of us who is corpus mentis and making a choice, a free choice, are moral agents, and we are responsible for those choices. And then this enters into the business world because, well, one of the big questions is how can you hold a corporation as an agent, because it's not a single entity. If you and I, crash our car into somebody, we can be held accountable because we thought and we chose. How does that happen in corporations? So corporations are held responsible through their corporate internal decision-making structure. And so they were seen as artificial persons through the Articles of Incorporation. And so a corporation does think and act as a corporation, but it is still held legally accountable for those actions in an analogous way as you and I would be held accountable for our actions.
So, but who is it, Elder? So children, is a child a moral agent?
I think the question of when one reaches responsibility is dependent upon the level of the reasoning ability and their ability to choose. And so obviously then in terms of children or elderly patients suffering dementia, then those again become the morally gray areas, which becomes the fodder for both ethicists and lawyers to determine was the person in sound mind? Did they know what they were choosing? And then to what degree do you hold that person responsible? And sometimes then, even if you weren't aware, you're responsible for being aware. So the classic cases like, I didn't know the speed limit. Well, as having a license, you should have made yourself aware of the speed limit. So yeah, so I would say moral agent refers to any rational, free human being who is responsible for their choices.
So excellent. I feel like, so when we talk about what is ethical, I think that's kind of determined by the society at large. And if we look at ethics in other areas outside of business, what's considered ethical has obviously changed over time. And I think there are a lot of factors that influence that, whether it be prevailing politics, ideology. In business, how has that changed over time? I like to think that the way that we view things as ethical has moved in the positive direction. Is that the case in business, where things that we considered, things that maybe were considered ethical 50, 100 years ago are now considered unethical? Though you talk about Pope Leo in 1891 with his encyclical supporting unions, that's gone back and forth in terms of the ethics of corporations versus labor. So how does it change over time?
Right. Well, I thought there's like three points in there. Yeah, so there's a triple header. So first, I would say that that it's like yes and no. There might be some ethical standards that do change, but others that might be consistent. So, for instance, truthfulness or justice, right? I would say those might be universal and transcendent values that whether I'm doing in the business context, whether I'm doing business in America or Japan, we would hope that the individuals engaged in that are going to be honest with each other. Going back to the question of, say, the example of Verm Navarro and the rights of unions and whether those rights are respected or disrespected, I think this would be the distinction between we have the theory, but then we have how that actually pans out in the real world. The classic case, and we just did this in class on yesterday, was the question of justice as basic human rights. And so we can spell out these are basic human rights in theory, but if you look at China, it has a horrible record of human rights and other places as well. So I think there's a distinction between what say the ethical values, moral principles are in the theoretical sense versus how they actually happen in the real world. And then I think how that plays itself out, if I remember correctly, how it plays itself out in the business community is that I tend to think that the world sets the agenda for the important issues of the day. So case of say slavery, I mean, it come full circle. Even if slavery was part of the economy more than 100 years ago, that certainly didn't make it right. I mean, so we say like basic human dignity is still basic human dignity, even if people don't observe it, and it was part of the business environment. And so I think that what are the important ethical issues in a business are contextualized, as you said, by the society, by what's going on in the world around it. I think today the buzzword is always the environmental sustainability issue and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And and it's kind of interesting when you look at the accrediting standards. It's like it shifts a little bit because I think it's responding to the needs of society or what society is saying that this is something we need to focus on. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Yes.
Like you say, ethics in business. Do you feel that, like, say one business isn't ethical and another business is ethical, but the product of their work is the same? Do you feel like people honestly really look into that and say, I'm going to buy one company or another, or they want the best price?
This is a great point because it takes two to tango. And so there is this expectation that society has that businesses act ethically. The flip side of that is that, well, then to what degree do we as customers or clients hold those businesses responsible for being honest and offering a quality product? And so, and that could go from everything from how I spend my money to investing in a sector of the economy to where I purchase my products. So I think the classic case is, Americans might say, well, we want to have the jobs in America, but if you're buying products that are made abroad and you don't care about the supply chain and how that product came to market, then you really don't have a lot of room to complain about it because you're willing to go to another business because it's a cheaper product and that product is made somewhere else rather than in America. So I think that's an excellent point that businesses are going to try to make a profit at the least amount of expenditure. And they sometimes get away with it. It's not legal, but they get away with it because the customers themselves, might say, are irresponsible in how they purchase. And so therefore, there's a responsibility that customers and clients have as well when they frequent business.
So almost like the customers themselves to the same ethical standard as the business itself.
I would say the same ethical principle of being responsible, but there's different ways of being responsible. So I said the way a business is responsible is different than, or being held accountable for what they are doing, how they are doing, and customers have to be responsible for how they spend their money, and then doing research. And again, I think it's convenience. If I just see a bottle of water there and it's easy to get it, I'll get it because we're creatures. But that's a defect of my character that I'm not putting the effort in, which I think comes back to this idea of character, that it's a two-way street. But your point brings that it's a complementary role. The businesses are held accountable, but customers, shareholders also have to be held accountable too for how they use their money. Because without the money, the business can't survive. It's like what?
Really, can I follow up on that? So, and I think that you described that well, but I think that it's more, it has to be about more than just character. Some people are constrained and compelled by economic circumstances. So take the factory chicken farming case. It's a great case study for business, right? So you have factory farm chicken that you can buy for $1.55 a pound versus free range chicken, which costs you $3.55 a pound. I have to make a decision. If I have 5 children and I work 3 jobs, I can't afford the free range chicken. I'm buying the factory farm chicken, even though I actually am opposed to it morally. So we live in an economic context too, right? That kind of compels us to have to make decisions. I mean, some people have McDonald's because that's what they can afford for their family, right? It's terrible. But so there are other things besides, I think, individual character that unfortunately force the hand of people into making certain decisions that might even be contrary to what they believe is morally right or wrong.
I probably would be as severe with the person who bought the cheaper chicken because they had 5 children to feed. Insofar as I think the fact that the person is sensitive to that and recognizes that they are making a choice that they rather not have to make. And I think it's because, and that's why I brought up those questions of culpability. So it's one thing to say, it kind of goes back to Evan's, the question Evan raised was like, there's ethical principles, but then there is how is one held responsible for them, or how do those principles actually play out in the real world? I think this is similar to that yes, I might recognize that I should spend my money in a way for buying chicken that is responsibly raised and brought to market. But unfortunately, because of my circumstances, I can't. There is this pressure upon, and here I would say it's kind of a question of what is the greater good: feeding my children or worrying about how chickens are treated. And in the hierarchy of goods, feeding my children is a higher moral value than how chickens are treated. Not that I would want to torture chickens to get them to market, but it's a legal.
Have fewer children.
Yeah. Well, I don't have I did buy the free range.
But I think it is that awareness that I'm doing something and I would rather not want to do that. I'm forced into this, and it doesn't necessarily negate that it's wrong, but again, wrong in the sense like if you care about the ethical treatment of animals, but that your culpability, your responsibility for that, I think, is mitigated. Well, thank you so very much for your time and attention, and I appreciate the questions.
Thank you, everybody. We'll be back here in I think just 3 weeks. Fox. Another 3 weeks following that, we'll be welcoming Tony Stradell. So thank you all for joining us today.
It's good. Oh, appreciate it. Appreciate it.
I had a question, but it was very small.
There's no
Very
small
small.
question.
So they.
No. I have to formulate it a little better. Well, it was just when you were talking about
Oh,
movement
okay, good. Maybe
and
you were-
federal law and enacting changes in business, which were